When we look at the Sharia of Islam, scholars would say that there are five main objectives that the Sharia seeks to protect: protection or preservation and promotion of life, paramount nerves, of deen, of faith, of the intellect, of the family or lineage or dignity, and of property or wealth. So, in looking at these categorizations of dars, in trying to help Muslims determine where they could live and where they could not live, because as we said earlier, the norm from the time of the Prophet was that Muslims could live anywhere as long as they were safe and it was okay for them to do so. So as Islam continued to spread, after the time of the prophets, the companions were moving to various lands. There were new Muslim people were accepting Islam, and this was at a time where people were very mobile. We didn't have the kind of restrictions of even if you want to move today, you probably think, okay, I need a visa, I have to apply. At that time there was nothing of sort. People could just decide to move to another land for various reasons, and then it became necessary for these scholars to provide some form of guidance for these new Muslims on how to determine where to stay. And in looking at all of these efforts towards this classification, the major goal is usually towards ensuring that this maqasid of the protection of life, of deen, and the others are achieved wherever they decide to stay. So because of this, scholars would say that it would be highly encouraged, if not compulsory, for a Muslim to migrate from a land where their life, for example, is being seriously threatened, or their faith is being seriously threatened, such that they cannot practice Islam, they're unable to pray, or they're unable to fast, those things that are very compulsory, or the fundamentals of the deen, where they are unable to do that, then that is when it would be necessary for them to leave those lands. But in a lot of cases, as long as these five things are not affected, their life is not under any serious threat. Yes, there may be some occasional hostility from, usually not from the entire community, maybe from one or two persons, that is bearable. That is not a problem. So there is no serious threat to life or faith or all of that. Then Muslims are encouraged to continue to live in this land, to bear with the hostilities or challenges that may come with being minority, because sometimes we have this majority minority issues that is not just religious based, whether it is racial majority minority, or it's ethnic majority minority. There is the kind of abuse of power that comes with being majority in a lot of cases, and there is some kind of subjugation or injustice or oppression that minorities face in a lot of contexts, irrespective of the type of minorities that they are. So it is quite expected that in a lot of cases, as religious minorities, they would face some of these challenges. But as Muslims, as long as there is no fear of serious threat or harm to life and faith especially, then these Muslims are encouraged to travel the earth, as the Quran continues to admonish us, and to relocate to these different places and continue to act in responsible and welcoming manner that would endear the acts of the people towards them. So it's to have this understanding, like Brother Jamila said, that these divisions of the world into all these different Dar Salam, Dar or Dar Islam, Dar Arab was is nowhere in the Quran, is nowhere in the Sunnah, but it is juristic efforts of scholars in a bid to guide people, especially at the time, on determining what is the criteria for where they should stay, where they should remain, and where they have to live. And when we now come to contemporary society, we need to determine how relevant are these are these classifications for us in today's world. Today's world, geography is no longer as flexible as it was then. The world is now very, very fixed in a lot of cases. and there are rules and processes for moving from one place to the other that people have to take cognizance of. And in today's world, the geographical division of nations and states perhaps is even more important to consider in determining where you can relocate to than the issue of the dire that the scholars of the past would have classified these places to be. So in today's world, what should still be the guiding principle for any Muslim who wants to reside in any place or find themselves in any land where they are the minority is to determine whether the objective of the Sharia is being achieved while they are there. Is there a threat to your life? Is there a threat to your faith, to your intellect, your dignity, or your property and wealth? If there is none, then you are free and encouraged to continue to stay in those places.
This is very interesting. Firstly, the fact that this classification is a product of juristic reasoning, responding to diverse contexts and communities in Islamic history, with a view of preferring appropriate rulings to know how to classify the world. We classify the world today according to all sorts of criteria. Economic criteria. At one time, the EU was the European Economic Community, and then it became a European Union. Before that, it wasn't. And so you find in one location treaties changing their nature. In Africa, you have the ECOWAS for West Africa, but there are other treaties like the African Union and other treaties with different countries on issues to do with climate, on issues to do with migration, security, etc. And sometimes even within a nation, if I think of Nigeria, some of the laws and freedoms Muslims have in some of the northern states of Nigeria are not similar to what they would be in other states. And sometimes you can actually go to a part of Nigeria that is actually hostile to many Muslims. So what one finds that in the same country, you actually have differences within states, and even within states, differences within local governments, and down to community levels.
I think it's important to add this factor because this declassification has led to some extremist groups beginning to think that because we have understood that this place is Dar al-Harb and we have left, or we have segregated ourselves, anybody who didn't, then that person is sinning. And in fact, in some cases, they said, if you stay, that means you are helping Darul Kufr. Then you are also a kafir. Then and your blood is same to be split, and then they begin to kill. Of course, in Nigeria, we have the likes of Boko Haram. Today, it doesn't matter whether you're a Muslim or you're not a Muslim, as long as you're a Nigerian and you're staying and not in their camp, then you are the same. These people take this declassification and use it even wrongly, extremists. So I think the more we are careful about how we use the terms.
This is important because, unfortunately, a subject that is the product of juristic reasoning, applying to changing contexts, in which the schools of Islamic thought, the Maliki, Shafi, Hanafi, Hanbali, the major schools, even within the Sunni world, differ. And you find differences even within a school, depending on place and scholar and all of that. So the problem is when a product of ijtihad is now being used as a basis for takfir, a basis for violence. It's an unfortunate misuse of juristic diversity on this topic. I'd like us to now move, Halima, on advice, guidelines for Muslims who want to move. You've touched on the issue of security, of your faith, of the maqasid and the higher objectives. But what else would you advise for Muslims who want to leave Muslim majority areas for whatever reason? I mean, sometimes Muslims are more persecuted where they are a majority than in countries where they are a minority. Places that are, I guess, with the United Nations and all these treaties, the world has become more like a Darul Ahad, or Darul Sulh, an abode of treaties where constitutions govern the rights of majorities and minorities. However, when Muslims want to move to other places where they may be minorities, what guidelines, what what advice would you give?
I think it is important for Muslims to realize that in this situation, when they have to or decide to travel, relocate, or just temporary relocation or permanent relocation to a place where they are the minorities, to take a cue from the Prophet ﷺ and his companions in terms of obeying the laws of the land and obeying the rulers of the land. Some Muslims have this belief that it is prohibited for a Muslim to obey a non-Muslim leader, for example. But we didn't get this from the Prophet and his companions. The Prophet and the companions remained in Mecca under the leadership of the polytheist leaders of Mecca, and they continued to stay until they had to leave when their life was threatened. And the same thing with the Muslims led by Jafar, who went to Abyssinia. They continued to live under the rulership of King Najashi, who was then a Christian, and they obeyed the rules of the land. In today's world, what is common is that when people have to relocate to other places, depending on where you come from and the kind of nationality or the passport you hold, you would need to get a visa, for example, in many cases, to move to these other places, especially if you want to relocate there permanently. And in a lot of cases, there are different types of visas depending on the country and your status and your purpose of visit. And as Muslims, we are meant to abide by our contracts, and so a lot of these visas would always have the kind of contract. So if it is a student visa, for example, in some countries, then you are not permitted to work, and as a Muslim on such kind of visa, it is part of your responsibility that you do not work if you are not permitted to. So if it is a visitor's visa, there are things you are allowed to do and things you are not allowed to do. If it is a medical visa, or if it is an academic researcher visa, whatever the kind of visa you have, there would be things that you are permitted to do and not permitted to do. And most times these things have to do not with things to do with your faith in terms of the ritual act of worship or anything like that, but really more to do with muamalat and what is legal and illegal for Muslims to partake in. So to realize that as Muslims, taking a lesson from the Prophet, it is important that we abide by these terms under which we were granted entry or right to stay in this land, as the Prophet, peace be upon him, had done. So basically, as a Muslim, and sometimes it happens that a Muslim is born in a non-Muslim land, and for many countries, while not all, for many countries, that grants automatic citizenship to such a child, and there are responsibilities expected of such citizens. For example, every citizen of the United States, irrespective of where they are in the world, are expected to do their tax returns every year. So as a Muslim who is a US citizen and who decides to still continue to hold on to that citizenship and not renounce it, it is part of your responsibility as a Muslim, for example, to make sure that you do that as part of your civic responsibilities and in line with the teachings of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him.
Jamil, what would you add to this?
This legal maxim, al-mu'minina ala shurutihim wa al-muslima inda shurutihim, that's very important. All that Sister Lima has discussed, once you have reached an agreement, then Muslims are supposed to abide by that. You are bounded by whatever agreement you have reached. So let us not, as Muslims, begin to cut corners and say we want to avoid some things. If you know you are not going to meet the term, don't agree to it. And of course, that means you are not going to stay there. But once you agree to the terms and conditions, then you have to fulfill it, because it becomes morally wrong. And it can even attract you sin if you go against it with Allah, because you signed it and you agreed to it. So you have to work by it. And of course, one responsibility that's a very good advice that we're going to give anybody moving is, don't forget your da'wah, which is calling to good and forbidding evil. Because in all situations, in fact, Prophet one day saw some people sitting by the roadside, just sitting, and said, this place is not good for you to see. He said, no, La Buddha, we can't. We will continue to sit. This is where we sit. Okay. Then if you are going to sit by the roadside, then give the road its rights. What is it said? Kafal aza. Do not abuse anybody or curse anybody or cheat anybody wrongly with maybe slang or slander anybody. Raddu salam. Anybody who passes and says salam, you must return. You must return this salam. Then amru bil ma'ruf. Anybody who is doing any wrong and passing, you will have to admonish the person. Anybody passing, you admonish him to do good, and then you forbid him or her from doing evil. You see, even just sitting by the roadside, that responsibility of calling to goodness and then preventing people from doing evil is on you. So there again, don't forget. And not only that, but even improving the community through social interaction. Do anything that will promote goodness on the land. Not only calling people to Islam, because that's in a way is a way of call that you are showing this is what Islam taught, that you should promote the good of the land. It's again in itself da'wah. So this is what we should do. And of course, once you recognize what conditions and acknowledge the legislations, like when the treaty was signed of Hudaybiyah, Muslim Prophet ﷺ looked at it, and all Muslims that were in Mecca, he said, you have to abide by this. Even though the terms were not favorable at all to the Muslims, but since we agree to it, then you have to abide by it.
For the sake of peace.
For the sake of peace, yes. Yes, if once we did not agree to it, then we are not binded. But since we agree, then so the legislation there should also be abide by. But of course, on the final note, avoid doing anything that is haram, that is against the tenet of Islam. Allahu Allah.
And I think, part of the purpose why scholars have terminologies for these places. So traditionally, for example, for some scholars, Darul Islam means where Islamic law operates, and that's the ideology of the state. And it's a Muslim leader, and it's majority Muslim. So it's called Darul Islam, and Muslims definitely can live there. But it has that definition because certain laws apply there. Another place is not called Darul Islam. It's called Darul Ahad or Darul Sulh, where during the time of the Sahaba, these are places where a treaty is what determines the activities. And yet Muslims still live there, as in Mecca during the Treaty of Hudaybiyah, but also as most of the world was outside Medina, where the Sahaba all moved to, and they had treaties in Egypt, in these places where the head of Egypt was not a Muslim. The heads of these other places were not Muslims. And Muslims should not expect that a Darul Ahad should be a Darul Islam. It's called a Darul Ahad, it's called a Darul Sulh. It has a constitution that is not Islamic. It may accommodate Muslims, it may accommodate certain principles of Islam, but not to assume that Muslims can only live in a place that is a Darul Islam, and if they move to a Darul Ahad, they must insist that a Darul Ahad must be a Darul Islam to recognize the rules that apply there. It's not a caliph. It could be a non-Muslim who is the leader of a Darul Ahad. It usually was a non-Muslim that was a leader. And to not look at it as that is something unacceptable when the Sahaba accepted that, carried on with their da'wah, respected the law, just made sure they were not being forced to do something that was clearly contrary to Islam that would require hijrah. I'd like to move on to the question of responsibilities. For Muslims who either born in minority context, or you were born in Germany, or born in Switzerland or the UK, or born in Angola, or born in Vietnam, wherever it is, or you migrated there, what are the responsibilities of Muslim citizens to their host communities?
Not so much different from the responsibility of other citizens of the country. One is be dutiful to the host community, your host or your country. Strive to better the community. Of course, this we have in the life, clear one in the lifetime of Prophet ﷺ when he joined that social group of Hilful Fudul. Is about promoting goodness in the society, to better the society. It is also very important that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, Kuntum khayra ummatin ukhrijat lin nasi ta'muruna bil ma'ruf wa tanhauna 'anil munkar. Of course, that you are the best of nation, ever evolved for mankind, that you enjoy good and you forbid evil. The point of note is for mankind. What is it for mankind? Enjoying goodness and forbidding wrong. And if you do that, then you become the best of nation. So that's the duty. Wherever you are, promote goodness and try to prevent evil. Then you are promoting goodness for mankind, you are preventing evil for the mankind, from mankind, and then you become the best of the nation. Of course, like Sayyidina Ikrima, Sahaba, Ikrima said, with the coming of Islam and Sharia, people who hitherto do not have security had security. Like in Mecca, there were clans that if you are taking decision, they don't have a say. In Medina, the same thing. He wants Aus, Azraj, but the remaining smaller clans do not even come close, because when they are talking, nobody considers them as people who should be consulted. But with the coming of Islam, everybody had the same status. We are all equal before God. Inna akramakum indallahi atqakum. So once it comes to common, what joins us as human being, there is no preference. The preference is with God. That is the most conscious among you. Then He's higher in status, but that is not within us. So that again is very important, that we should continue to bring people goodness. And Prophet ﷺ told us, Khairun nasi anfa'ahum linnas. The best of mankind is the one that is more beneficial to mankind. So if you would not, what then? Again, your responsibility is about how do you better the lot of your neighbors and people that live around you. And if you do that, and I do that, and the other person does that, then all of us would together better the lot of the community. So all of these things are things that we should look at. And if you see, like this scholar Abu Saud said in the commentary of the same verse, Kuntum khayra ummatin, he said, yeah, it means you are a helpful community to others, to mankind. So how are you helpful if you are not enjoying and promoting goodness? You can't be helpful. So most importantly is ensure that you are dutiful, and we have a lot of examples in the Sahaba, in the Prophet, and even the community before us. Allahu Alam.
Sister Halima, what would you?
Yes, in addition to what Madam Jamila already talked about, to also take a cue, for example, from Prophet Yusuf, who was a foreigner in Egypt, even though he got there in very unpleasant circumstances. But that still did not stop him from being a useful contribution to the society, to add value to the society where he found himself. And he was so valuable to the community that he ended up becoming a minister within that community. So that just shows us that as Muslims, wherever we find ourselves, the question is, what value can you add? He already talked about enjoining right, forbidding wrong. In addition to that, the Prophet, peace be upon him, already said in a hadith that the best of us is the best to people. So how beneficial are you to people? In another hadith, he said that Allah loves, part of those who Allah loves the most is that the person who is most beneficial to mankind. So and these are very general verses. It's not about being beneficial to Muslims only, but being beneficial to people generally. And this does not just showcase you as a good person, but it also showcases you as a good Muslim. And I'm remembering that at every point in time we are ambassadors of Islam, and especially in non-Muslim communities, or where Muslims are in the minority. A lot of people do not have the opportunity yet of reading the Quran for themselves, or reading books of hadith on their own to learn about Islam. So the Muslims that they interact with are actually the embodiments of Islam that they have first contact with. And so every Muslim, especially in such context, is an unappointed, unpaid ambassador of Islam, and as such, we should continue to be a good example of what Islam is and what Islam teaches. And trying to be beneficial to the society, for example, could involve volunteering for charities within your community, being involved in community service and community building programs that would help you to be able to impact positively within the community, and also help to in many cases change the stereotypes that a lot of people of other faiths have about Islam as a result of their interaction with you. It is not impossible, and it is quite common to meet people of other faith and who would meet you and I had a Muslim neighbor, and then they will continue to talk glowingly about these people, and I love Muslims because this Muslim neighbor of mine did so and so and so good things to me while we were neighbors. So to realize that all of these actions and responsibilities do not just benefit us, but it also rubs off on Islam in the long run. And there are also acts that could be very rewardable, could be act of sadaqah to jariyah, charity which reward would be everlasting depending on how far the benefits continue to go. And also to realize that the reverse is also true, that when we do not model good behavior as taught by the Prophet in these places, when we do not bring value to the communities, but instead what people know about us is harshness or hostility or irresponsibility and things like that, it just doesn't rub off on us as individuals, but it also reinforces the negative beliefs and stereotypes that some have about Islam. So at the end of the day, in the long run, it also rubs off negatively on Islam. And I believe no good Muslim wants to be a bad representation of Islam. So to ensure that in all of this, in our interactions with people, in our host communities, that we are concerned about the higher objectives of the Sharia, the preservation of life, of the intellect, of property, not just of ourselves, but also of other people, and to ensure justice and kindness and compassion and good manners and good neighborliness as the Prophet taught us.
Thank you so much. I think you've touched on a lot there. The examples of Yusuf, of many other prophets, Moses, but some of these prophets who, just as Allah sent prophets to all nations, some were prophets, not messengers. So they just contributed good to their communities as prophets. And as Muslims, we find that in the lives of the Sahaba. They went as minorities to different parts of the world. Some went as business people to different parts of the world during the time of the Prophet and after. But gradually, they influenced their communities that became more accommodating of Islam, more freedom of religion and beliefs in these communities, greater social justice, greater opportunities, and these communities have changed for the better, and may Allah continue to guide and help us all. Thank you very much for your contributions. Jazakumullahu khairan. Until next time, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh.